Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay. Never comes again, another day like yesterday. Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.
Good morning, everybody. I'm a bit of a mess. As you can see, I still have my biking gear on and I have not shaved. No worries. Life continues apace. I've had a very, very busy but full and enjoyable November and of course December with the holidays continuing. There seems to be no let up, but again, a lot of joyful experiences. I think I'm not managing my pace that well, so as you can see, I think I'm getting a little worn down. But I was excited to come in and do an episode, and I don't have enough time, and I think that maybe this might be 2 or 3 episodes, because for me, this one is really big. And I'm in the middle of it. So at the beginning, when I have a realization where I go, I get it, I get something, it's usually like the cracking open. And there'll be one really clear theme that I'm like, oh, okay, I see. I can see myself in this. I can see other people. I can see how this works. But then as I continue to stuff just cooks in my head as I walk around and, whatever, and I'll revisit it and I think it expands. And then at some point I'll get really excited and I'll want to write about it. And then I'll keep trying to expand. And then at some point I'll realize this is just fluff. And I'll realize, no, I've cooked the subject. There isn't anything else to think or say about it for me, right? There might be other people who have additional subtleties and complexities and colorations to add to a particular subject. But for me, it's like, I've figured out the meaning of it. There's nothing left to say. Well, I think I'm halfway through that. There's been the seed of this realization for years now. It's something I recognized about myself. It's something I recognized about my father. And so I'll tell you starting, and this is why I think maybe this is going to be multiple episodes. I have only an hour before my first incoming. So I don't think there's any way I'm going to cover the subject. But just to let you know that there's still thinking to be done on it, and I'm literally doing the thinking and explicating it now in front of you. So the realization, in a weird way, I've said many times that I had a very difficult relationship with my father, and at some point I just stopped attempting for reasons I won't go into. But from a distance, I learned an enormous amount from my father. I learned from watching the things that he got right, and I learned actually way more from watching how he didn't get things right, and then would suffer and struggle and get angry at other people. And you could just see this very clear connection between his behavior and how he set things up, and then these frustrations that he would have for why they didn't work, but he couldn't see that he had set them up to not work. And it's also interesting how when we recognize these things in our parents, we're always like, well, I'm not going to do that. That's just silly. And then you may look back and go, I've been doing that, just a different version of it. So the thing that I'm identifying about my father is, pardon me, guys. I spend so much time clearing my throat in these podcasts because they're usually in the morning. Apologize for that. The thing I recognize about my dad, there is definitely a genetic component to IQ and to intelligence and the ability to take in information, to process information, to synthesize information. Taking in is just, you have the capability of your brain absorbing what's coming in. You have the ability to remember it, but the most important thing is you have the ability to make sense of it. And then the highest level of intelligence is the ability to synthesize it. You're able to take that information and then apply it to the world, whether you invent a new machine or whether you explain something in a way that other people had never been able, right? That there was this truth that no one had ever been able to see. And you're like, wow, when I take in the same information, I see something that nobody's identified, whatever it is. So that's intelligence. On my dad's side, my mom's side had a certain kind of intelligence, much more grounded, less verbal, less intellectual, academic. On my dad's side, there was a significantly higher level of IQ, and I think it's genetic, but I think it's also family culture. He often told the story that his grandparents, who lived in a tar paper shack, for entertainment would read the dictionary. Well, there are lots of things that impoverished people do, but in their family, they read the dictionary, right? And that tradition continued on down. All of my uncles, my dad's brothers, had a startling ability to explore perspective and to explore fairly complex philosophical, like no matter who they were or what they did, there was a level of intellect there. And my father was regarded by some as verging on genius. He seemed to have a near photographic memory. I inherited the same thing. A lot of it's gone away as I've gotten older. Hopefully I don't have dementia, but I don't remember things. I still remember things at a higher level than average, but not the way it was in my 20s and 30s, where it was just like, it was effortless. What I saw and understood was in there forever. I often use the example, I'm not super good with numbers and math, blah, blah, blah. But at one point, I learned that the speed of light in a vacuum is 186,000 miles per second. Well, that's there. It's just there. It's there. It just stays there for no reason, right? So that's not credit to me. That's just something. It's just some function where my brain's able to do that. His brain was able to do that at a high level. So, and my father, at a very young age, he just sort of ripped his way through a master's. I think he graduated high school either a year early or a year and a half, something. He got married at, I think it was 17. He had to have permission from his mother because he was a minor. I think my mom was 20 and he was 17. He ripped through a master's and then did a PhD in biochemistry, which is not like, that's a very challenging PhD, right? So there's a real academic skill. And something I noticed about him that used to bug me was, well, yeah, here's this guy with a significant intelligence, a somewhat exceptional talent, right? There are lots of other people that are very intelligent. There's a lot of people who are very intelligent and people who are more intelligent than him, right? So this is not to just say that he's just some beyond, like he's Einstein. He's not. But what bugged me is he would surround himself with people who didn't have those skills or for whom their lifestyle and their particular brilliance and way of being, right? There are people, for example, blue collar folks that it's like they have a real genius in knowing how things work and having worked through how things work by, doing things with their hands and blah, blah, blah. And they look at academics and snicker the same way academics snicker at them. Because they're like, yeah, you sit here and have a bunch of ideas and turn them around your head and blah, 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 but you can't do anything. Right? You're helpless, right? And vice versa, right? So whatever, my objective is not to get into insulting anyone, but to say that the folks that my dad surrounded himself with were people who had very few skills like he had. And it became really apparent. Part of that was because that's who he was raised around, and to a certain extent, emotionally, that was his culture. He was, forgive me for saying it, he was basically a poor white trash genius, right? But that's what he was raised in, impoverished white people culture. So he would surround himself with these people and then act like two things would come out of him. One would be this arrogance. You could just see this little boy glee that he could talk or run circles around them academically, intellectually, whatever. When he got into arguments, he would get into fierce, intense arguments with them, and you could just, it would be written all over his face, this feeling of superiority, almost like a predator getting a chance to take someone down. And it really bugged me as a kid watching him do that. So there was the component of arrogance and a feeling of superiority that he gained. And I always remembered the one time I really noticed that I was probably 12, 13 years old. Our little town would have a 4th of July festival. And one year at the fair or the festival, they had a spelling bee. And so he's going up against loggers and telephone repair people and, whatever. Some people may have had a college education. Many did not. Some didn't finish high school, whatever. And he's just ripping through with a near photographic memory. Every word that comes up, he's just ripping through, like just, there's no, it's silly. And the same smug look that he would get on his face that I saw on his face our entire childhood, he would compete with his kids and he would get the same smug look of self-satisfaction was on his face. And to me, that was embarrassing because it's like, number one, that's not very kind. These were the parents of my friends, and these were people that I respected, and these were adults, many of whom had been very kind in ways that my parents had not been, and I respected them, and I loved them, and I felt cared for in that community. So that made me mad. Also, there were the echoes of the fact that he had had that smug look on his face every time he bested me in anything, no matter, like, you could be 4 years old, he'd get the same smug look in his face. So there was the arrogance in it, but there was also anger. He would experience, I think, sometimes near rage that we as kids didn't understand what he understood when he tried to help you with your math homework or whatever. And you could see him try to manage it to not be an abusive parent, where if he was like trying to explain algebra or whatever, like he just couldn't handle the fact that you didn't have the insight about how this worked and what this meant. And he would very quickly just walk away in like extreme frustration and say stuff like, you're not getting it. Maybe you'll never get it. And he'd just walk away. And there was this anger towards people who were not aspiring to, right? Again, they had their intelligence and brilliance in the way they did things. I saw this also, my grandfather, who was a farmer who had none of that type of thinking, academic thinking, but there was something much more grounded and wise in his relationship to earth and life and plants. And I watched my dad and my grandfather working on a pump down by the creek. And my dad was intellectually working through, and my grandfather knew what was wrong with it, but my dad wouldn't listen to him because my dad, again, was very dismissive of someone like my grandfather. And I could see that my grandfather knew what was wrong with the pump, and he kept saying simple things, it's not getting suction. Well, that's a simple thing to say, but he knew what he meant. But my dad was not listening and wasn't gonna listen because you needed to break it out verbally and scientifically and go, hey, this is what's going on, this is why it's going on, et cetera, for my dad to respect your perspective. And I could see that my grandfather felt dismissed and frustrated. But of course, my dad had been that way to everybody his entire life. And he had an advanced enough IQ and intellectual skill that he had gotten away with it because he was really smart. So not to just beat up on my dad, he worked with that, and I'm proud of him for the fact that as his life advanced, when I was, I think even still in my 20s, he began to say stuff like, I'm not a genius. Like, people have said that, but I'm not. And I think he really recognized his own arrogance and began working with the recognition that in the entire world, there were a lot of really stunningly brilliant people, and that he was on a spectrum in there, and that people who didn't have the talents and skills he had didn't deserve to be condescended to or dismissed, because if they did, then he deserved to be condescended to and dismissed. And he had been treated that way by other people, some of them who weren't smart enough to do it, and some of them who were. So I think he began to recognize that in late midlife and late life. So here's the point of that, is that I never wanted to be that person. And it really bothered me that he treated people that way. I had and have significant intellectual skills, perspective skills, philosophical skills. And my father grew up in an environment that rewarded that. And so I had the same thing, where it's not just that there was a natural talent, but also within the family, that was kind of everything. Everything was that. You grew up listening to arguments and debates between your uncles, and my father never allowed a moment to go by. Like, you couldn't get away with making a statement that was uninformed or whatever. In his worst moments, he was going to mock you and tear you apart. But in his best moments, he was just going to provide larger perspective. Like, you just weren't going to get away with having an unformed thought. So the point of this exploration is, I felt ashamed of my father when I was young, because I recognized the pettiness of it, the immaturity of it, the childishness of it. And I didn't want to be that ever. And I really worked hard my entire life to see the wisdom and the brilliance of how anyone inhabited space and what they brought to a situation. And I recognized that just having verbal acrobatics, which I have due to like the enormous amount of reading and also natural verbal skills, blah, 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 doesn't mean you're smarter. The fact that you can beat the crap out of somebody in an argument and talk circles around them and bring up a bunch of evidence, I promise you, means jack shit for whether you know more than someone else. And I know this from being that person. We're still primitive enough as a human race that you can look around, and people who have a real amazing skill at verbal acrobatics and the ability to process and synthesize information unconsciously just use it to be self-serving and to manipulate people who don't have the same skill into believing that they've presented a transcendent truth that should not be challenged. And they're full of crap. It's completely self-serving. And again, I've been that person where I'm like, well, this is how it works. And, if you look at it this way and blah, blah, blah. And if you look at this philosopher and this is obviously whatever, but it was just serving a perspective that was mine. And it was mine for me to learn something about my own limitations and the limitations in how I relate to myself and other people and other life and reality itself. But I was running this out there to people who didn't have the verbal acrobatics, and then convincing them that I must have some transcendent wisdom, and I didn't. Right? And our world is full of that now. It's full of people coming on, talking heads who are very good at talking, and they'll take whatever the latest data is that doesn't really suggest something, but if you don't really understand science and, direction of causation and correlation versus causation and blah, 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 people don't know, and they'll just go, oh, this new chemical discovered that does whatever and, may heal cancer, whatever the crap it is, and they'll have some supposed evidence, and it's full of shit. They just talk better than other people, and they know how to sound as if they're presenting the truth. It's not even about me. I'm just revealing to you, blah, blah. No, you're full of crap. Right? Our world is rife with that. So I didn't want to be that person, and I worked really hard for my entire life to not condescend to people. And I had weak moments where I would have a temper tantrum like my father towards romantic partners or whomever. You know, I have a cousin who has one of the fastest minds I have ever witnessed. So incisive and so fast, and a very clear level way of saying things. And she was younger. And I remember a moment when my brother and her sort of postured up and were like, blah, blah, blah. Like in our family, like when we think that you're stupid, we'll literally just yell like, you know, why, you know, blah, blah, you think, well, that's ass. We'll just communicate that we think you're asinine. And it's like, in hindsight, she's smarter than I am intellectually. Like, I don't know about wisdom. I'm not interested in that, but she's faster, more incisive. Maybe she didn't have, right, I'm older, but that doesn't mean shit. My father was older than me, and he was emotionally primitive in the way that I'm describing. Right, so I've had my temper tantrums in this arena, and I did everything I could not to be that person, but I did it anyway. I just shifted it to, well, you can hear that there's an arrogance and a superiority in how I look at my dad. Right? And this is something I started working on a couple years ago, or actually longer, when a string of people who I really cared about, 5 or 6 people very rapidly within 5 or 6 years died. And I realized how deeply I loved them. And as importantly, I realized that they had loved me. And I realized that I had leveraged a feeling of moral offense, that there were ways in which they behaved that I found offensive or that I found morally primitive. Like my father, emotionally, intellectually brilliant, but in so many ways, emotionally quite childlike. And that because I seemed to have been born with a certain moral clarity. Like I'd see cruelty as cruelty, cruelty to animals as cruelty. The meat industry is just rife with cruelty and misery. I knew that when I was a child. It's only now the society is only beginning to go, hey, this is a problem. Like we shouldn't be doing this. I knew that when I was 5. So that was my gift that I didn't earn, I don't think, whatever. I was just always knew that. I always knew, I could always see when humans were being cruel to one another or cruel to others, and I could always see that it was so childish and unnecessary when adults couldn't see it. And so I had a natural talent in that way that my father did not. He could be quite cruel. And I had developed this feeling of superiority. And then these people who loved me, who I loved, started dying. My first supervisor, who was one of the kindest, most genuine people I've ever met, had done a couple things that were mildly questionable that offended me. And rather than me telling him, and we'd sort of become friends after I moved on and was licensed and blah, 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 but I'd kept him at a distance. And then he dropped dead one day. It was gone. My sister, one of my closest friends, who I met when I first moved here, who had held at arm's length for decades, because there were ways that he inhabited reality, and there were sillinesses. There were ways that he was stunningly full of crap that everyone knew he was. That everyone knew, just don't listen to him when he starts talking about this thing. Just don't. It's an illusion that only he sees or believes. Just don't do it. But I used that to establish a feeling of superiority. Like, I don't feel like talking to him. He's going to run this thing and blah, blah, blah. I could have talked to him and just distracted and just given a big hug and been, just been like, I love you, man. And he would have he just poured love into people. And that was his brilliance. So much more important than my moral superiority. His capacity to love, so much more powerful and important than my moral superiority. And yet, I abandoned my chance to experience it and receive it, and also to give it. Because even though I didn't do what my dad did within the domain of verbal superiority or intellectual support, I didn't do that. I watched him make that mistake and said, I'm not going to do that. I don't like it. It's shitty. Like, he really hurt people who didn't deserve it, and people who were better, just better humans than him, right? At least in a different level of development, of awareness of kindness to others and compassion and how complex things are, and that there is no particular talent that really makes you better than anyone else, because that talent will be its own limit and it will create limits in you. And if you don't recognize that, then you're the one who's not seeing, and that was me, right? So I didn't do what my dad did, but I had developed my own version. I felt morally superior to my father because he was trapped in a little boy superiority, a need to be smarter than other people. My need to be superior to people wasn't to be intellectually smarter. I pursued that for myself. I take great joy in processing language and learning and being able to synthesize information and share it. I take great joy in it. I love it so much. It's so much fun. But I never thought I was better than people. But when it came to moral, ethical insight, I had far surpassed my father, who would be very cruel to people and not think twice about it. But ironically, in the fact that I could see at a level by the time I was 5 or 10, that 90% of the adults, 90% of the world didn't see how sick we were and how much pain and suffering we constantly inflicted on other people. And I've mentioned many, many examples of when I had these realizations that started by the age of 4 or 5. I was deeply disturbed and bothered by cruelty to animals, routine cruelty. And I've shared many of those. I'll share one of them. When I was maybe 6 years old, when we would visit my grandparents, my grandfather doted on me, and it was such a lovely, lovely experience. I loved it. Felt so good because my father was quite detached and cold and cruel towards me. My grandfather would take me in to get my hair cut, and sometimes he would leave me at the barbershop or whatever. Now, there was nefarious crap going on where, well, it's his story. I won't go there. He was doing things he shouldn't have done, and he was also using me as a cover to do that. So sometimes he would leave me in places with people I didn't know. And one of these places was with some, I don't even remember adults, but there was some kid I didn't know from Adam. He was like, well, you're going to hang out with him. And so hang out with this kid. He was just a normal kid, not a bad kid. A normal kid. And I remember feeling so stressed out and disturbed because this kid was like, hey, you want to play with my rabbit? I have a rabbit. I was like, okay. He was like, this is my rabbit. It's mine. I can do whatever I want. My mom says it's mine and I can do whatever I want. Look, I can do this. And he grabs a rabbit and holds it up by both ears. And I start getting really uncomfortable because I'm like, I can see in the rabbit's body that it's starting to move into fight or flight. This is not fun for this rabbit. It knows that this caretaker has no perception of its needs or no respect for its body and no respect that it might be a primitive animal, but it experiences the same fear, and it knows when it is not cared for and when things can happen to it that are deeply unpleasant. And he was like, look, I can, and he took a bucket and he put the bucket on top of the rabbit and sat on the bucket and trapped the rabbit in there. And I was very uncomfortable. At that point, I was just like, I just want my grandpa to come pick me up. I don't want to be here. And I tried to distract him and like, hey, let's go get some candy. Like at the back of the barber shop, they had a bowl of candy for kids who got the hair cut. And they were like, you can take as much as you want. Take a handful. Take 2 handfuls of candy. Right? Primitive people being caring, but okay, so I was like 5 or 6 years old, maybe 7 max. This was before I started school, so it had to be 6. I started school in 1st grade. I didn't know I was homeschooled. So at that age already, I was deeply disturbed by this kid was not a sociopath. This is just normal amongst the human race. It's just normal to view living animals, living beings as just a toy for your entertainment. That's not the exception. That's the rule. That's still the rule. We're only at the infancy of recognizing the immense cruelty and suffering we inflict on other living things and on ourselves. We're only at an infantile stage of waking up and going, oh, we do this. And then there's masses of misery and suffering and disconnection from self and others and reality and disconnection from joy and peace and blah, blah. And we're like, why is life so hard? It's like, why the fuck do you think it's so hard? But see, again, this frustration is my version. So I had that realization I already knew that. And I developed this arrogance. So I did the same thing that my dad did. And I hurt people with my moral arrogance. Okay, I was given the talent to see something that other people didn't see. The only reason that's given to you is so that you can go through the hard, arduous, often painful task of being kind and loving and understanding of other people, and to begin to send out into the world the message. It was my job to write articles, to speak on it, to express it, blah, blah, not to get angry and cut people off and be like, you're a torturous piece of shit, like you don't get this. Well, now I'm the same. If a rabbit is a primitive life form and people think it's okay to be detached and cruel and do whatever they feel like doing, and then in one aspect of what it is to be a conscious being, I've been given a gift where I see something that other people don't see, and I know that it's true. I've always known that it's true. I've always known what cruelty is and what the absence of cruelty is and what love and care is. Always. And I've always been able to see how adults and people who are supposedly leaders and even religious leaders like, have no idea what real kindness is. If that's been given to me, and yet I get angry and become abusive and dismissive, I'm no different than that boy who doesn't recognize that this more primitive life form of the rabbit deserves care and love and deserves, like, if you have the power to put a bucket over it and trap it or hang it by its ears, that power must be used to tune into the subtleties of what a rabbit is and to do everything you can to help a rabbit be a rabbit and express as a rabbit and live the life that is most beautiful for a rabbit. That's the only moral imperative you have. Because as you do that, you will express and you will become more unfettered and freer as a consciousness. It's not just to serve the rabbit, it serves you, right? So this was my primitive state. This was my confusion. This was my blindness. This was me feeling more morally superior to my father, and feeling morally superior to the boy with the rabbit, and feeling morally, like, there's so many examples I can't count. One example I've used is, now that's too specific. There are people who will know. I'll use the example of one I've used many times before, of when I was probably 19 or 20. I worked for a veterinarian clinic and dogs would come in with skin problems, and sometimes that was just the mange, sometimes that was just dry skin or an allergic reaction or dryness, but a lot of times there's skin mites, these little microscopic creatures that would dig in under the skin and propagate. And you would take a skin scraping and put it on a slide and look at it in a microscope, and you would see what to humans are these revolting little spider crab-like creatures, so ugly and alien, like swimming around. And so then you would give the dog a dip, which is going to kill them, right? And I always remembered the doctors would encourage me. I think they wanted me to become a veterinarian. They recognized the compassion and the ability to tune into the fear or the need for care for animals, which was there. So they encouraged me to learn these and to memorize them, et cetera, et cetera. And I got busy and I came back 45 minutes later, half an hour later or whatever, and I looked at the slide, and what had been a languidly moving creature was now frantic and jerky. And I made the connection that it's like the light bulb turned on high underneath the slide had been slowly heating the oil, the medium in which you put the skin scraping, and this creature was being cooked to death. And I looked at that, and I know there's so many people who are like, well, you can't anthropomorphize, and it's like, shut up. That's the dumbest thing ever. And I'm doing my limitation right now. You're watching me do it. My anger at people's inability to make the connection of, oh, all living things subjected to conditions in which their life is threatened and their body has conditions inflicted on it in which life is no longer capable of thriving, suffer, and it's torture. And it makes me so angry that people are like, because it's self-serving, right? They're like, well, I don't really want to think that. I don't really want to know that, dropping a lobster into boiling water is a horrible, torturous act. I don't want to know that. I like lobster. I don't, but, right? And we're so self-serving. We're like, well, if 50% of everything we do, what are we supposed to do? Well, I don't know the answer to that. I'm an idiot. I don't know what the answer is. I'm not interested in lying about it. Right? So at the age of 19 or 20, I could see something like that and go, everything suffers, everything. Routinely, in the process of living, we inflict terrible suffering on other living beings. And all of the dialogue of like, oh, but their nervous system is much more, well, you don't really know if you're scientific about it. It may be just nothing more than an autonomic response and blah, blah. It's just like, shut up. Stop. Okay, what is that right there? That's my primitive blind response. To condescend to and to inflict, to imply that these people who have that blindness are stupid and frustrating, and I don't want to deal with them, I don't want to speak to them kindly, is literally my weakness. It's my blindness. That is my blindness. I am blind. And if I'm angry and frustrated with them, with their blindness, why am I not angry and frustrated with myself and my blindness? applying this condescension and anger and frustration to them is nothing more than a reflection of my lack of understanding of myself. I am blind. If I do not have the capacity to see that we're all born into this confusing world and we're taught that it's okay to hurt this thing and not that thing, and we're busy and we're tired and we're struggling to live, life comes at us constantly, we have so many problems to solve, and it's so easy to just believe what people who have come before us have told us. And it's comfortable to believe that because we don't want, it's actually from the goodness of their heart that they don't want to believe that it inflicts pain and suffering. They don't, because they don't know how to solve it, and I don't either. And I live with the discomfort of knowing how much pain and suffering there is, that I can't lie to myself about it, and that I also participate in it, right? My inability to make space for them is my inability to recognize my own blindness and to make space for myself. Locking them up in this condescension and this judgment locks me up in condescension and judgment directed at self. There is a person that I'm quite interested in. One of the coolest stories I've ever heard. Vinnie Tolman. I'm going to have to break this because I have an incoming, but man, this is why I knew this was going to be like a massive expansion of a bunch of thinking. Vinnie Tolman was a young man, a weightlifter, I think an evangelical, quite dedicated to religion, etc. And he's readily admitted that he didn't live by many of the precepts, was maybe a bit of a womanizer. But there were genuinely good things about him. His deep loyalty to his sisters who were adopted from Korea, and being in a homogenous culture, you know, they would receive racist behaviors and that he would basically punch people, right? Which is maybe not the best thing. All right, so you have this person who, forgive me, Vinnie Tolman, for telling your story for you. You should go look it up. It's so interesting. Basically, he ordered a supplement, and he and his buddy, on a day off before going to the gym, took the supplement, and there was a misunderstanding because of foreign script on this was a highly concentrated version versus what they usually got. And so they took a toxic, mortal amount and very quickly were in trouble and tried to whip into a fast food restaurant to get something to eat to offset what they were experiencing. And his friend passed out at a booth and vomited all over the table and quickly received care to rush him to the hospital, pump his stomach, and to revive him. Vinnie Tolman went into a single-use bathroom and locked the door, where he became violently dizzy, violently ill, passed out, fell on his back, and vomited on his back and aspirated his vomit and suffocated to death. Died. I've listened to his story over and over and over. I read his book multiple times. And part of the fascination is, as a person who's scientifically minded, there are many near-death experiences where you're like, clinically, supposedly, you were scientifically dead for 4 minutes on the operating table. But I don't really know what that means. To me, that doesn't really prove anything, right? We know that the God particle, the brain floods with, I forget the name of the God particle, the brain floods with this chemical in which people have these incredible experiences of seeing a tunnel of light, or they see whatever, they have this very spiritual experience. We know that physiologically that they have that. So maybe they're having a spiritual experience, and maybe it's just their brain dying and giving a burst of this chemical to try to solve whatever problem, right? Maybe evolution has tried to help us solve whatever is killing us in a last-ditch effort, floods with this chemical. I don't know. I don't have the answer. I'm not a spiritual leader. So many near-death experiences, in my opinion, are questionable because we don't really know where the tipping point of death is. We know that the body has a long process to die. Your fingernails grow, your hair grow, even after you're long past the possibility of coming back. The reason Vinnie Tolman's story is so interesting is because when you do the math, for sure he was dead at least 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes in that bathroom. Dead. And when they discovered him, I won't tell the whole story, go check it out. He was already starting to slightly stiffen at the joints, and he was becoming cold. And the ambulance came, and they determined, oh, this guy's gone. Call the coroner. So what that means is they didn't rush to do anything. They put him in once the police came and they did the paperwork and they sort of like figured out what happened here. Oh, he was the friend of the other guy, whatever happened. But he died. They put him in a body bag and zipped it up and finished paperwork with the police officer who showed up. And we're on the way to the coroners or the medical examiners, whatever it is, with him in a body bag, strapped down in a body bag, closed. That's at least 45 minutes. And then they're driving, and then one of the medics, one of the EMTs, a new guy, is bothered. Now, I'm not even telling you Vinnie Tolman's actual story. I'm just telling you the scientific part of it. Is bothered. And he decides to, it bothers him that they didn't get a chance to try. So he unzips, and against the instructions of the senior members who tell him he's going to get fired because he's breaking protocol, and there's a point at which it's against the law to mess with a dead body. He unzips, feels for a pulse on the femoral artery, and then starts applying the paddles and shocking. And he does it once, twice, and the guys are yelling at him like, you're going to get fired, you can't do this. And then there's a faint heartbeat, and does it again, and on the third one the heartbeat comes back very faintly. So at least scientifically, medically, the body has come back to electrical activation and the heart is beating. At this point, this guy's been dead for sure an hour. You do the math. He's been dead for an hour, and it may be as high as an hour and a half. But forget it. Don't debate it. There's no way to deny that it's been minimum half an hour. But it's for sure an hour. That's easy, right? But it might be an hour and 20, because then they have to rush him to the hospital. They have to try to revive him. Now, long story short, is not my story to tell. He was aware the entire time, watching all of this happen and having an experience. I mean, what people call a near death, but in his case, I would just say after death experience. And then he was in a coma for 3 days, and then he came back to his body after 3 freaking days. Now, the reason I'm weaving this in is to say that he had this experience with a guide who introduced him to various things after death, in which he experienced profound love, acceptance, where he slowly released and let go of traumas and beliefs and et cetera, et cetera. And you should read his book. And he comes back with 10 principles. And the second reason I find his story so fascinating is because through my work in psychology, I can tell you, you don't need to believe in God. You don't need to believe in near-death experiences. You don't need to believe, but that the 10 principles that he lays out, I can 1,000% verify are absolutely true about human psychology. 100% true, every single one of them. And I won't talk them through because I could spend 45 minutes on each principle and tell you how I discovered through my own experiences and also through the experience of working with people to heal, that there are certain things in human psychology and how we relate to ourselves and others and what we think of ourselves are as true as gravity. It is a physics of how the human condition works. There are certain things that are true, and the principles he was given track and underpin every single one of those things. But bring it back to this podcast, and I'm gonna have to close because I'm 10 minutes out and I'll have to continue. Or maybe I'll do this thing piecemeal. One of the principles he espouses is that his guide tells him there are these things you have to let go of and cleanse yourself of to go visit heaven, which he did. One of the things you have to cleanse yourself of is judgment or bias. And his immediate response is, oh, I got that one wired up. I was raised in a homogenous environment that is pretty biased, and there are racist people. And my two adoptive sisters were from Korea, and they loved and took care of him. He had a very difficult childhood. His father was quite abusive with him. In one of his stories, he relates his father beat him with a 2x4 until he dissociated or was visited by a guide. I don't know. And his sisters were very loving with him, and he loved them deeply. And he's told how he fiercely defended if anybody, there was even a hint of racism or mocking or whatever, he would literally just go to war. He would like fight, right? He's like, I am not biased. And then his guide asked him, okay, so there's all these people who are racist and biased. How do you feel about them? Oh shit. Hate them. Oh, you're not biased? You're biased against those people. You don't have understanding and forgiveness towards those other people. You don't have care and insight into why they would be that way, what they might have experienced that makes that a position that's reasonable for them. That one's so hard for all of us, especially those of us, especially, for example, the liberal community is like so morally superior, and they figured out kindnesses and ways of making space for, the LGBTQ community and for races, and they're working so hard. But the more they experience resistance, the more judgmental and critical and brittle the liberal community becomes. And they and then they become exactly what they hate. The more you fight what you hate, the more you become what you hate. So that was in the Vinnie Tolman story, right? From his guide. And here's me. What's my blindness? People who don't see how much pain and cruelty we inflict, who use sort of self-serving, unconscious perspective to entitle themselves to do things that are injurious to others, and go, oh, it's fine. No, but you're just, okay, my anger, that attitude you see in my face is my blindness and the judgment that is still within me. It's my limitation that makes me equal to whatever their blindness is. You think my blindness is less blind than their blindness? It isn't. Okay, I got to close there, but that's a good place to stop. That part of what this whole podcast, and my father, God bless him, I don't mean to throw under the bus, but he's very intellectual and philosophical, and I think generally he's okay with these discussions as long as it's not really cruel. He's okay with me using his experience because he did learn a lot. He didn't become kinder towards me or more understanding, but in general towards people and towards himself, he developed a lot of perspective and understanding of who he had been, and I think he learned. So I told the story from my father's perspective and my perspective of watching him and what I learned from watching him and how I invented the same system he did with the same blindness and then had to go, oh, this is just my version of it, right? And I'll continue the podcast when I get a chance, after I see my clients, or maybe I'll do it piecemeal. But This whole general podcast, this episode is about relating to people who have a blindness and what it means when you're angry and frustrated at other people's blindnesses. What it means about you and where you are. And this is also to explore that I am recently, something is raising into my consciousness that is a theme of my entire life, that is so deep and so unconscious that only now at 57 years of age, I'm going, or am I 58? Frick, I don't even know. I'm either 57 or 58. I don't know. I don't care anymore. This work is so much fun. The work of refining your own awareness and ability to see what's really true, which always reflects back to you ways in which you have not seen. This work is so much fun. I don't care how old I am, whatever. I feel grateful and blessed that I have a chance to be conscious and to work with my consciousness in this lifetime. I love it. I love it so much. It's so much fun. You got to do it. It feels terrifying and painful at the beginning, but you got to do it. It's the best thing ever. It's love and joy and consciousness and freedom. It's freedom. It's the path to freedom. So this episode, or this portion of the episode, is introducing the rest, which is about a deep unconsciousness and my relationship to a certain type of person that has been my entire life. And how my father modeled it for me and allowed me to hate it, which revealed, and to hate it in him, which reveals my own blindness, but also gave me a look at it from outside, which I'm grateful to my father. In a way, him remaining unconscious and being so stunningly cruel and narcissistic about it gave me a chance to see it in the extreme, that gave me a chance to see it and understand it in a more subtle, sneaky, insidious way in myself. But this episode is about this relationship to a certain sort of person, and it has implications for all of us because this happens with all of us. So I'm going to leave it on that cliffhanger. Maybe it's not a cliffhanger for you. I don't know. Maybe this is all boring, but whatever. To me, it's super exciting and really fun. I've got incoming. Love you guys. I will continue. I must pause for now. You have a great day. Bye.
Just for today, everything's okay. Everything's okay.